Going to continue with a session this afternoon looking into a green international tax reform. As we know, the current global crisis in terms of climate represents an unprecedented challenge for our society. So in the next panel, we are going to be joined by two experts who are going to discuss the opportunity of including environmental and sustainable development objectives in the international tax system and suggest avenues for doing so. Following these presentations, our two experts will open the floor and they'll be joined by a moderation for a brainstorming session with participants. So joining us now is, to begin, Madame Corinne Lepage, antérieurement ministre de l'Environnement en France. Bonjour, Madame Lepage. Madame Lepage est docteur en droit. C'est la cofondatrice avec Christian Huglot du cabinet d'avocats Huglot-Lepage. Elle a occupé de nombreuses fonctions publiques, membre du Conseil de l'Ordre et secrétaire du Conseil de 1987 à 1990. Ministre de l'Environnement en 1995 et ce jusqu'en 1997, député puis premier adjoint au maire de Cabourg de 1989 à 2001, député européen de 2009 à 2014. Elle donne des conférences dans de très grandes entreprises à propos de l'évolution des enjeux climatiques et environnementaux liés aux enjeux économiques. Et donc, ça nous fait grand plaisir d'avoir Madame Lepage avec nous aujourd'hui. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Comment allez-vous?
Fort bien. Je suis très honorée, très heureuse d'être avec vous, avec mes amis canadiens.
Parfait. Alors, peut-être qu'on peut commencer avec vous, Madame Lepage, pour nous exprimer justement, pour nous partager votre expérience et les idées qui vous passent par la tête par les temps qui courent.
Je pense que le sujet des impôts, des taxes et de l'environnement est un sujet absolument majeur. Parce qu'on en a besoin pour deux raisons. On en a besoin parce que d'abord, on a besoin d'argent pour payer la transition énergétique, la transition écologique. Et que cet argent, il faut bien le trouver quelque part. Que deuxièmement, nous avons besoin de mettre en place des cercles vertueux, c'est-à-dire des systèmes économiques qui encouragent les entreprises comme les individus à faire les bons choix d'investissement, et les bons choix de consommation. Et par voie de conséquence, le prix, donc l'intégration dans le prix d'une taxe, est un élément extrêmement important pour aller dans la bonne direction. Aujourd'hui, on se rend compte, alors je ne connais pas bien le système au Canada, mais enfin je connais un peu celui de l'Europe, que finalement, quand on cherche à acheter des produits qui sont sains, des produits qui sont bio, quand on cherche à avoir un comportement, je dirais, vertueux, ça coûte généralement plus cher quand on a un comportement qui ne l'est pas. Donc, il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas. Le problème, en réalité, est celui de voir comment est-ce qu'on peut internaliser les coûts, portés à la collectivité par des comportements qui ne sont pas vertueux. Alors, c'est bien sûr la question climatique, c'est la question de la biodiversité et c'est la question que vous avez déjà un petit peu abordée en parlant de l'agriculture et des pesticides, de tout le volet santé environnementale, qui est aussi santé de la nature, d'ailleurs, parce que la nature et l'homme, sur ce sujet-là, nous nous retrouvons. Or, les coûts collectifs qui sont supportés du fait du dérèglement climatique, du fait de la dégradation de la biodiversité, du fait de la perte des ressources, du fait des atteintes portées à la santé humaine, ces coûts, aujourd'hui, ne sont pas assumés par ceux qui les font supporter à la collectivité. Et donc, l'objectif de la taxe, c'est précisément de voir comment on peut intégrer ces coûts précisément dans les processus de production et dans la fixation des prix à la consommation. Sur tout cet emplacement qui est quand même très très large, hein, puisque ça comprend de très nombreux domaines. Alors, on a beaucoup parlé de la taxe carbone, que nous les Européens, nous n'arrivons pas du tout à mettre en place en Europe, que nous n'arrivons pas à mettre en place en France. Et pourtant, nous voyons bien que tant qu'il n'y aura pas une taxe carbone, nous continuerons, d'une part, à mettre des fonds publics pour subventionner les énergies fossiles, En France, le gouvernement vient de prendre un engagement d'arrêter en 2035, ce qui est vraiment très, 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 très loin. Et ce qui veut dire que pendant 15 ans, on va continuer encore à donner de l'argent alors qu'il faudrait en réalité en prendre à ce secteur. Et deuxièmement, il faudrait effectivement, si on veut aller vers des transports propres, une culture de la proximité, des circuits courts, évidemment que le carbone soit taxé. Il ne l'est pas. Vous avez parlé de la question des pesticides. C'est un sujet extrêmement important, tant pour la santé que pour l'environnement. Parce qu'on se rend compte, nous avons actuellement en Europe et en France des très grands débats autour des néocotinoïdes, c'est-à-dire de ces produits qui tuent les abeilles, mais aussi autour du glyphosate. Et je crois savoir qu'au Canada, vous avez des problèmes assez comparables, ce qui est normal puisqu'on a tous les mêmes problèmes, on utilise tous les mêmes produits. Le fait est que s'il y avait une taxation de l'usage de ces produits, eh bien, ils seraient beaucoup moins utilisés et les produits biologiques auraient un avantage compétitif qu'ils n'ont absolument pas aujourd'hui. Alors que ce soit au niveau du protoxyde d'azote, qui a un effet sur un gaz à effet de serre, ou que ce soit par le biais de la contamination des sols et du vivant et des humains, il est clair qu'il faudrait qu'il y ait une taxation qui contribuerait largement à en réduire l'usage et à rendre au contraire beaucoup plus attractif d'autres types de procédés agricoles, y compris l'agroécologie. Si on parle maintenant des ressources naturelles, la question du paiement du prix réel de la ressource naturelle est une question qui est vraiment extrêmement importante, et à commencer par la question de l'eau. C'est très bien que la question de l'eau va être une question absolument centrale dans les années qui viennent, puisque la manière... Alors, c'est en plus un produit de première nécessité, parce qu'il ne peut pas y avoir de vie sans eau. Donc, il faut absolument que les gens puissent boire et avoir de l'eau pour leurs usages courants. Mais ensuite, il faudrait qu'il y ait un système qui soit vertueux pour aller vers une utilisation aussi réduite que possible de l'eau. On en est, enfin en tout cas en Europe, on en est encore extrêmement loin. Je ne sais pas où vous en êtes au Canada, mais chez nous, nous en sommes extrêmement loin. De manière plus générale, la question de la rareté des ressources n'est pas suffisamment pensée en termes de fiscalité. Elle est même très peu. Alors, on peut espérer que l'introduction de l'économie circulaire, de l'intérêt économique à la réutilisation des matières premières, au recyclage d'abord et à la réutilisation des matières premières ensuite, peut effectivement générer des économies, mais si on veut que le système marche, il est évidemment essentiel que, dans le même temps, le recours à la matière première originelle soit découragé par rapport à l'utilisation de la matière première secondaire ou recyclée. Or, aujourd'hui, malheureusement, on constate que bien souvent, les acteurs économiques ont un encouragement économique, parce que la fiscalité ne marche pas là-dessus, à utiliser une matière première primaire au lieu d'utiliser la matière première recyclée ou réutilisée. Donc, ça ne va pas parce que ça ne conduit pas à la mise en place de filières pérennes. Or, on a besoin de les construire. Et on voit très bien, effectivement, qu'il y a là, je peux appeler la vieille économie, qui freine des cas de fer pour éviter, effectivement, qu'il y ait une taxation suffisante qui décourage l'usage de la matière première primaire à l'avantage de la matière première secondaire dérivée. Et on le voit sur énormément de produits. Ici, je prends un exemple tout bête, ça coûte moins cher d'acheter du papier qui sort du bois plutôt que d'acheter le papier recyclé, d'utiliser. Les filières de recyclage de papier ne marcheront pas. Voilà, donc ça veut bien dire que, en fait, tout notre système doit être pensé à la mesure de l'impact collectif des produits, de manière à permettre l'internalisation des coûts externes et de manière à aller vers ce que j'appellerais une vérité écologique des prix. Aujourd'hui, nous n'avons pas de vérité écologique des prix. Et c'est tout à fait regrettable parce que ça ne permet pas effectivement la transformation des comportements individuels et ça n'encourage pas le monde économique à aller suffisamment rapidement vers la transition. Autrement dit, et je terminerai là-dessus parce que j'arrive au bout de mon temps, c'est très bien d'imaginer des subventions publiques pour aller dans telle ou telle direction, mais on sait très bien que les subventions publiques, après ça, ça fait des dettes et il faut bien les assumer. Ce serait beaucoup plus intéressant d'aller beaucoup plus directement vers un système de taxation progressive, puis il faut que ce soit bien entendu supporté par le monde économique et il faut qu'il y ait une harmonisation au niveau planétaire, ce qui est encore une autre paire de manches. Mais aller vers une internalisation des coûts par les taxes, y compris par de la fiscalité aux frontières. Et moi, j'ai été député européen, comme vous l'avez gentiment rappelé, et j'ai toujours milité pour que l'Europe se garantisse contre le dumping social et environnemental et qu'on ait le courage de mettre à nos frontières un certain nombre de taxes, quitte à ce qu'il y ait des représailles, mais au moins ça incitera les autres à aller ensuite dans la même direction. Il y a une valeur exemplaire et on sait très bien que quand une région du monde fait quelque chose de bien, les autres râlent et ensuite ils finissent par faire la même chose. Voilà. Donc je pense qu'il faut être courageux, qu'il faut être imaginatif. Nous passons des temps très difficiles. Je ne sais pas quel est l'état d'esprit au Canada. Je peux vous dire qu'en France, franchement, on a tous le moral dans les chaussettes. C'est terrible en ce moment, mais je pense que c'est un aiguillon pour faire œuvre d'imagination, pour se projeter dans le futur et pour essayer de travailler intelligemment. Voilà, je vous remercie de votre attention et j'espère avoir respecté mon temps.
Absolument, c'est nous qui vous remercions, Madame Lepage. Et puis, ici aussi, on essaie de trouver des pistes de solutions pour les défis auxquels on fait face. Donc, merci beaucoup d'avoir partagé avec nous votre pensée et votre expertise. Et puis, je vais passer maintenant la parole à Madame Blanca Moreno-Dodson pour poursuivre cette conversation. Et puis, je vais passer à l'anglais, si vous le permettez bien. Donc, Blanca is the manager of the Center for Mediterranean Integration with the World Bank. She's the director, and that's a knowledge exchange platform that was created by the World Bank in partnership with Mediterranean countries, including regional authorities, international financial institutions, and civil society, hosted by the city of Marseille, en France. Blanca has over 28 years of experience at the World Bank. She holds a PhD and a master's in international economics and finance from the Université of Aix-en-Marseille, in addition to a master's in economics from the University Autonomous of Madrid in Spain. And Blanca is fluent in Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese. So Blanca, we look forward to hearing your thoughts as well.
It's a great honor for me to participate in this Global Tax Conference, and I want to thank Brigitte Alepin and the organizers of this conference. I miss seeing you in person, like when we organized it in the World Bank, and also I attended once in Montreal, but it is amazing what you have done to put this all together under the current circumstances. And I'm very humbled to follow Madame Lepage, who is a real expert and who has really presented the most important ideas. I don't think I can add anything. I totally agree with her, and perhaps I can elaborate and give my views as an economist, and also focusing a bit more on Europe and the Mediterranean, the part of the world where I work now. It is interesting that at the time when we're all being affected by the pandemic, which is triggering a dramatic economic recession, worse than any other global crisis or even a war in the past, and we are talking about green fiscal reform. And it seems like maybe at odds at the beginning, but then in reality, this is the topic to talk about, because the recession is inducing an acceleration of the trend towards decarbonization. And this is perhaps one of the only positive sides of the recession. It is true that partly is due to lifetime changes. We all adapted to teleworking. At the same time, we observe a shortening of food supply chains, relocation of manufacturing closer to consumption, and a movement that some call deglobalization or regionalization. And all this has had an impact to reduce the demand for energy. We observed that there has been a spectacular shift from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. The largest ever annual fall in CO2 emissions happened in 2020, more than during any previous economic crisis period. This, if you want to be optimistic, would tell us that, in a way, helps us get closer to the Paris Agreement objectives to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. But in reality, to achieve that goal, we would need to have similar annual declines for 10 consecutive years. So this is how far we are. So the recession is only helping marginally, but we are witnessing some behavioral and structural changes in energy consumption. It is realistic to think that at some point after the recession is over, there will be a rebound in CO2 emissions. So the message is that we need to do what's possible now to put in place ambitious green stimulus package. It is the only way. And fiscal policy has a very important role to play in this process. We can leverage fiscal policy to reduce carbon emissions and minimize any adverse impact on the economy. So I want to focus on three main fiscal instruments that have been already mentioned by Madame Lepage: eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels, which could really help realign price incentives in favor of renewable energy. They could also create additional fiscal space, and many countries need it very badly, and this additional fiscal space could be invested in low carbon infrastructure. Particularly relevant in the Mediterranean region, in the MENA region, fossil fuel subsidy removal would be very, very important because the region holds the highest share of global pre-tax energy subsidies in the world. But it is encouraging to see countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco, where there are important energy subsidy reforms that are being put in place. The second instrument I want to talk about is carbon pricing, which would play a fundamental role in the transition to a decarbonized economy. It is a simple, flexible, low-cost, fair, and efficient policy option to address climate change. The idea behind putting a price on carbon, as Madame Lepage said, we have to put a price on the ability of some, or the willingness, the choice of some to pollute, and that has to be priced. And by putting a price on that harm to the environment, we would tell economic agents that they need to internalize the harms from emissions of carbon dioxide. So carbon prices, at the same time, can become a source of revenues. And this, again, would help to put together some of the stimulus packages that are being needed now because of COVID and that are considering a drain on public finances. If the carbon price is imposed only in a single country or region, however, it could internalize emissions only from activities in that country. A unilateral carbon price would create an incentive to shift activities offshore to countries where perhaps there is no price on emissions or the price is lower. This is the phenomenon called leakage. So to the extent of the leakage, the carbon price fails to internalize the harms from emissions and distorts the location of activities. This potential for leakage could create incentives for countries not to price carbon and benefit from the relocation that the high emitting industry would do, escaping for the countries where carbon is being taxed. So to control for that, control for carbon leakage, the only way to do it is to impose carbon border adjustment, also the point that Madame Lepage mentioned. So the carbon border adjustments are a way to either put a price on imports or a rebate on exports based on the concept of embedded carbon. Part of the EU Green Deal, which really is extremely ambitious, and Europe should be the first carbon neutral continent. The European Commission has prepared a communication proposing carbon border adjustments as a means to address the risk of carbon leakage while remaining in compliance with World Trade Organization rules. This measure will also be a source of revenues, and those revenues could help repay the funds that are needed for the next generation European Union. This concept of the carbon border adjustment, in some cases, has been criticized or considered controversial, cumbersome, and there are a lot of people who don't agree with it. But the application, if handled with care, could give good results. Those measures to protect from leakages are a bit risky because we don't want them to trigger a climate trade war, right? Because that would undermine all efforts towards global decarbonization. But I believe that the adoption of carbon border adjustment by the EU could certainly have a transformational impact on trade across Europe and also across the Mediterranean region, affecting all countries in all forms of energy and energy-intensive manufactured products. I am afraid I'm leaving you with more questions than answers, but I hope this is all food for thought and it can be useful for the upcoming debate on international green fiscal reforms that you're having. I really hope this is a very fruitful discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Blanca, for sharing your thoughts with us and, you know, giving the way to a potential framework for international tax reform with respect for the environment. So actually, it's good that it raises all these questions because we will continue the conversation with our group of participants. And to do that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the brainstorming session that's about to begin. Madame Corinne Péloffy is going to be leading this conversation. Madame Corinne Péloffy is a parliamentary affairs advisor in Canada since 2019. She holds a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford in the UK. She holds a BCL LLB from McGill University's Trent's Systemic Law Program, and she was the director of the Quebec Centre for Environmental Law from 2014 until 2018. Bonjour aux participants, et puis I will leave the conversation open to you. Thank you so much.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup. I will stick to English to try to make things simple. So I was told this first brainstorming session would focus on the international situation and provide an overview of current issues and prospects for the implementation of an international tax reform. However, before the first speaker was done with her keynote address, we already had 5 people lined up with questions and comments they want to make. So I feel like there's energy in our virtual room. So instead of going with my plan, how about we go with your questions and try to flow organically from there. So I have a list. If I don't, I'm just going to list them quick. Make sure those people all get their say on this session, which we have until 2:27 Eastern Time Canada. So first it will be Marta. Second, Jacqueline. Third, Quentin wants to talk about trade-offs. Fourth, Antoine wants to talk about political momentum. Yvette would like to cover EU dimensions. So let's make sure we cover all those. But if you feel like you want to jump into the conversation, please do. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir d'être ici. I've been asked is why an international green fiscal policy reform is urgently needed in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic for a sustainable and resilient future? This is the question to answer. And let me first of all say that there are no a single reason. And secondly, I would like to remain that this was urgently needed even before the pandemic. During the COP25, which was held in Madrid, it was manifested that we need to up the ambition of climate change policies, and particularly using economic instruments for adaptation and mitigation. Among others, we need to use environmental taxes, we need to use ETS system, and at this time, Article 6 of the Treaty of Paris was a really a key issue. Now, more than ever, we find ourselves in a vulnerable and unpredictable position. So the urgency to me to take action is at an international level is even greater. We are already talking about mitigation. We are not talking about climate change in a general way. Then we need to take action, because if we don't, the cost of mitigation will increasingly be higher, and the cost will be translated into more resources in the long term. I think this is more or less my point of view. And let me add that I think it's very important to have a well-balanced among tax policies, environmental policies, commercial policies, and competition policies. Blanca mentions before that the trade war should be a danger if we don't use well and we don't address well our target in tax incentives, and if we continue to incentivize bad subsidies for fossil fuels. This is more or less my point of view, and thank you for this interesting question.
Blanca, would you like to bounce back, or anyone would like to comment?
I will make a small comment, if you allow me. First of all, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to actually add something to what Marta just said. I think that, the environmental aspect of green fiscal reform is extremely important, and it's of course the main objective and the main goal why these reforms are being done. But there is another important aspect which maybe we're not considering as often, and it is the reduction of inequality. The pandemic has really exacerbated inequality that were already existing in the system, and it has made them worse. And green fiscal reform, through both the reduction of subsidies and carbon pricing instruments or other economic instruments, is really a golden opportunity to make sure that we reduce those inequalities, both by the simple fact that the more vulnerable segments of society are also more vulnerable to climate change, but also by taking into account that revenues raised through economic instruments can be usefully purposed towards redistributional activities, and to make sure that the more vulnerable segments of society have better access to cleaner energy, but also have better access, for example, to health and to other instruments. So I think this is an important aspect to consider as well.
Something I'm just going to segue before, I don't know if Blanca, you wanted to add something. Something I've heard in the first interventions is this need to increase the pace of action. In my own work with Senator Galvez, we've actually stopped using the word transition and started using the word transformation, because we're so late on actions that, the ambition needs to increase every time we're not ambitious enough. So with that in mind, Blanca, I don't know, you closed your presentation on a specific solution to put forward, the carbon border adjustments. I was wondering if you could maybe say a few more as to like what are these really ambitious things that we could think of right now to implement international cooperation. And right after that, we'll go to Jacqueline, who has, I think, a new question to reframe the discussion.
Thank you, Karine. Just a few thoughts to share with the audience. I think that it's good that Europe is taking the lead in implementing this carbon border adjustment, because you need an economic union behind. It is hard enough to put a price on carbon, let alone to agree on how that price would be determined, and even more difficult to enforce a border adjustment that would prevent industries from shopping and going to the country that has the lowest price on carbon. So the only way to do it is to have legislation behind, to have institutions behind, and we know that a lot of other initiatives that have been launched by the European Union have taken time, and sometimes some countries have fallen out of the agreement, but it is the only way. And I think Europe, especially if they do it in coordination with countries in the south, in the Mediterranean, because I believe in the Mediterranean energy market, a lot of the natural resources come from the south, and there is a tremendous potential to trade between the north and the south. If Europe launches this reform in the countries in the south of the Mediterranean also make an effort to collaborate and put in place similar instruments, similar carbon taxes, similar prices on carbon in the south of the Mediterranean, this could constitute a very, very good example for the rest of the world. But as I said, it is not just about the price, it is about the institutional mechanism behind to make sure that it works out. I also wanted to pick on the very good comment Elena made on the inequality issues. I believe, as Vito Tansi, who spoke in this conference, I think earlier today, who is one of the perhaps the fiscal economists I have always admired the most. He is talking about this being a crisis of inequality. It is hitting the poorest and most vulnerable the most. It's almost acting like a bonus on the rich and the privileged. So we need to have measures that correct those disparities that are being aggravated by the crisis. And fiscal space is not available in all the countries. You need to act not only on the revenue side, but also on the expenditure side. We know that even if you put in place progressive taxes, because we hope that the carbon tax will be progressive, but we need other tax instruments. But more importantly, we need expenditure measures that correct the inequalities. And for that, you need fiscal space, you need revenues. And the carbon taxes could help generate those revenues. But we also need a commitment from countries to really revise the composition of public expenditures and see what kind of infrastructure they want to put in place, what kind of activities such as mines they want to close after the pandemic. This is the time to close some of the high carbon producing activities, and this is the time to stimulate greener activities and change the way we operate, as Madame Lepage indicated. This is just we need a change in paradigm, in the way we consume, in the way we produce. But you don't do that overnight. You need to give incentives. And the taxes, the public expenditures, the carbon tax border adjustment measures, all those go in the direction of providing the right incentives and giving the right signals to consumers that if you want to pollute, you're going to pay for it because you're damaging the rest of society. So this is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
I was invited to come in, Karine. Well, one thing that occurred to me when I saw this question on why an international green fiscal policy reform is urgently needed was to really think about the premise of the question a little. If we think about it being urgently needed, is the international what we really need? Is it realistic and feasible? Is the best use of our time thinking about an international green fiscal policy reform? Or do we need to narrow it down? I think one thing that we've done so far already is we've narrowed it down very much to look at carbon rather than a more general green fiscal policy reform. It might be that we need to narrow it down to certain sectors, to be thinking about really big emitting sectors, first of all, to be thinking about sectors that are easy to hit. If we're looking at something international, to be thinking about all these equity concerns that have been mentioned. So looking at aviation, for example, even then it might be a real challenge to find agreement. So we might need to be thinking about which countries are we looking at. Are we looking at the EU first to take a lead, as has been discussed already, to look at a border carbon adjustment mechanism? Because obviously that would also have a rollout on other countries outside the scheme, and in cooperation with low and middle income countries, that has a great deal of potential without having this aim of an international agreement to which all countries have to agree. Or are we looking at something that might be targeting wealthier emitters? There was some work done by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty in 2015 in the run-up to the Paris conference, where they highlighted the fact that the biggest 10% of emitters emit about 45% of all emissions. Perhaps an agreement amongst to tax those wealthiest groups would be a way to move forward without having to have an agreement that would hit everybody, and that would solve the equity problem as well. And finally, perhaps just targeting the G20 first of all. They emit about 78% of emissions altogether. So that might also be a possibility. So just to throw that into the mix, is this question the best question to be answering? Is arguing for an international reform that's truly involving all countries? Is that the best use of our time, given the urgency, given the need for a paradigm shift? Okay, I'll stop there to try keep in my minute.
I'll editorially comment that having watched climate negotiations for 30 decades, which is most of my life, going nowhere, I really hope there are alternative solutions to having a global agreement, because even global agreements don't necessarily seem to get us much further. But I'll piggyback on Jacqueline's attempt to open up the topic more broadly, and I'm guessing you're asking, is there a space for maybe unilateral or multilateral action that is not the whole world? And can we broaden beyond carbon and carbon tax? And on this, there is a question from the public, which I will most likely massacre, but I'll do my best. Basically, it refers to a study from 2016 by the XTAC project in cooperation with Deloitte, EY, KPMG, and PwC, examining the impacts of a tax shift from taxing labor to taxing consumption and natural resources use. So based on that, and the study had concluded it was a viable option for Europe. The question asked whether it's a viable question for Canada or any country that is based on natural resources exports. Is this the sort of policy taxing consumption and natural resource use that would get at the equity question and the broader environmental issues that include climate change but are not limited to it? Go ahead, just unmute yourself, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think in literature it's referred to as a double dividend, if I'm not mistaken. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that when thinking about green taxation, while the aims are very good, the economy is already depressed. So adding further burden might not be something that countries might be interested in at the moment. And just from my own experience working with countries, that's an objection that keeps coming up. You know, like the socioeconomic is already depressed. If we want to add more burden, that's not really politically feasible. And then this is an alternative where you at the same time tax pollution, but you don't create fiscal space because it's revenue neutral in a sense, but indirectly because you will be incentivizing greener activities, while at the same time disincentivizing dirtier activities, you do indirectly raise employment, raise economic activity in greener sectors. So, I mean, I think it's a very good point.
Jacqueline, go ahead.
Just to come in very briefly, I think it's a very good point. And what we should remember is that very often you can shift some of the revenue, for example, to compensate specific sectors, but you don't need to shift it all. So there is a possibility to create fiscal space with this kind of taxation, compensate those who are concerned about an equity impact and nevertheless have revenue to use for something else. And if you're looking at the developed country context, or high-income countries, very often you can see that these kind of taxes are referred to as growth-friendly. The EU, the OECD, they call green taxes growth-friendly taxes. So they don't consider them to be taxes that have a burden on the economy. So I think to an extent, it's also a misnomer. It's a concern that a lot of countries voice, but I'm not sure if you use the revenues wisely, that's a very legitimate concern, and there aren't ways of addressing it that the revenue that you raise can deliver on.
Can I add something?
Yes, I think there's Antoine, Joe, and then Marta and Mr. Sharma. I haven't noted those down, so please just pop up one after the other as you can.
I would just say the idea of raising carbon or environmental taxes and then reducing other taxes, it makes a lot, it's the double dividend. It makes a lot of sense from a theoretical point of view, but you hit limits relatively fast. For instance, we know from all the places in the world that rely on natural resources royalties, how they feel the roller coaster of those revenues going up and down. It makes for very unstable public finance. If we're serious about our ambitions to reduce emissions, that means that our carbon taxes are going to bring in no revenue in a relatively short time. So replacing taxes that we know are still going to work, labor taxes, consumption taxes, that we know are true and tested ways of raising revenue that we can make fair. It's not necessarily an excellent idea to replace all of those revenues with environmental taxes, which ultimately we hope to bring in no revenue from. So that's something to keep in mind. It can be used to reduce probably the taxes that are the most problematic amongst the ones that we use. But the basic architecture of our tax system should probably stay the same if we wish not to be in a revenue crisis and be forced to bring back those taxes in 10 or 20 years. So that's something we must keep in mind when thinking about the double dividend.
Absolutely. I just wanted to really strongly agree with what Himanshu said about kind of linking taxes to employment. We're going to see the film, which is coming up and debuting in a minute, about how important employment taxes have become to governments, and what we're now going to face is a jobs crisis throughout the world. So linking environmental taxes into environmentally friendly employment paths is something that I think can be quite a big sell for countries.
I think it was Marta and then Himanshu.
Yeah, very brief intervention from my part. I think international taxes are changing a lot, and also tax principles. We know that our taxes in all the countries are mostly the same, and indirect taxes are pushing forward. But I think this time is the time of regulatory taxes. And among the regulatory taxes, the carbon tax, a very strong carbon tax, could help to have resources. And with this theoretical theory of double dividend or multi-dividend, you can use these resources to push forward a more just transition, ecological transition, and not only ecological transition, but social and just transition in the end.
Thank you, Himanshu, and I think Elena also raised the hand. Am I missing anyone?
I just wanted to nuance my point a bit. So I know from another meeting that I had last week that Ireland had been thinking of introducing this double dividend, and they had some communication, public consultations on how would this design look like. And apparently in that public consultation, what the response was that people felt that this was a needless shifting of the tax base. And so they weren't in support of this, which intuitively to an economist might not sound reasonable or rational. But I just wanted to put it there that we also have to, when thinking about these ideas, we also have to think about the political economy aspect of it. Is this actually feasible to implement? So theoretically, I mean, Antoine made an excellent point that theoretically it's a good idea. I support it, but at the same time, you also have to accept that there is a challenge with how we communicate it and how we kind of present it to the public in terms of political acceptance and sustainability.
Yes, I also wanted to briefly comment on what Antoine said, and to some extent to what Himanshu just said as well. You know, at the United Nations, we often refer to the post-COVID phase as a phase where we build back better. And the idea behind it is that, you know, all these reforms need to be structural. Of course, you wouldn't just use the revenues from a carbon tax, for example, to patch up some holes in the revenue system, or even to replace revenues from fossil fuels, for example. But it's more of a question of using these revenues to create systems that are just more resilient and that are more fair and transparent. And of course, investing, for example, in renewable energy, financing renewable energy is a way to ensure a number of, not just a double dividend, but a number of additional benefits, such as job creation, lower environmental impacts, etc. And I think really what this pandemic has taught us is that it's not about spending more, but it's about using the revenues that are already there and are already existing to address some of the systematic inefficiencies in our systems that lead also to, as I was saying earlier, more inequality. So I think that is really important to keep in mind when thinking about the post-COVID scenario.
Given that Elena just touched on COVID and the post-COVID scenario, I will just pause the order of questions for 1 second and maybe go to Tarcisio, who I think wanted to address specifically sustainability issues around the COVID crisis and the recovery. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So the points that I wanted to make refer to something that was said before, which I totally agree, which is the idea that COVID didn't actually create these problems that we're seeing now, but only exacerbated them. And you know, it is indeed a crisis of inequality. So what we have seen so far is that what COVID has shown us that especially for big multinationals, specifically in the digital sector, what we have seen is that these companies have started to profit much more than they were profiting before. So COVID only exacerbated those situations, and I think this creates a momentum to think about other taxes beyond the ones that were discussed so far. So one example is the idea of focusing on economic rent and focusing on access profits and the possibility of some companies to profit much more than others, which could be taxed at a much higher rate because it's efficient, it is risk-free in terms of affecting competition, it is equitable because it realizes ability to pay much more than other taxes, and it's and you know I've been developing an idea of a global access profits tax, which is something that is feasible if we think of the work that the OECD is already doing in the field. So it's something that could build on in institutional and international governance structures that we have, and that could use things like CBCR, country by country reporting, and could use the project the OECD is already putting forward to just add something on top of that. And by focusing on that, we could get to a better place, I believe. And then the other thing that I wanted to add is you know, a lot was mentioned on price adjustments. So one thing that we can do already, because this idea of a global access profits tax would need some consensus, right? But one thing that we already do is that we already adjust prices for tax purposes when it comes to transfer pricing regulation. And the idea would be to start adjusting prices in order for them to reflect sustainability issues and impact. So we could start adjusting prices for products on the basis of their impact and what the impacts that they have for society, for the environment, for the economy. And with that, and this is something that we can do at the moment, we don't need global consensus for that. We already have transfer pricing rules in place that can address those issues. So I think those things are relevant when we talk about prices, when we talk about sustainability, and when we talk about COVID. Thank you.
Before I go to Quentin, I will abuse the microphone again. I find this conversation extremely interesting. I'm sort of new to the tax angle of things, but one thing we're interested to look at in Canada, and I think it ties to you know, higher income folks having a disproportionately large environmental footprint, carbon footprint. You know, more and more reports are coming on that. The Piketty report was mentioned. And in the wake of the crisis in Canada, the public polling shows that 85% of Canadians are in favor of a wealth tax. our country rarely gets numbers high like this on any issue. We tend to split half often and stick to the middle. But anyway, so I was wondering if this link between wealth and environmental footprint could maybe help sell the idea of some taxes that try to get at those both. I'm actually not going to ask the question, just making the comment and see if you want to bounce back later on. But I will go to now, I think, Quentin, who wants to talk about trade-offs.
Yes, thank you for having me. I will try to answer the wealth tax later on because I might have an interesting answer. On trade-off, I think that Elena covered it in the beginning, and we know that the main trade-off is that we need to balance the sense of urgency. We have less than a decade to act with equity and fairness concerns, because we're not in a theoretical model, right? We're not applying pricing to a perfect world. We're in a world with increasing inequality, and the French example is actually quite good. We tried to increase carbon prices in France, and this sparked a huge movement called the Yellow Vest movement against the French government. Now, a couple of lessons from that phenomenon, including on the acceptability of carbon prices. The first one is transparency. The whole movement started around the fact that people thought that the revenues from the carbon tax were used to pay for tax cuts for big multinationals. The fact that it actually did or not was irrelevant. People thought so because there was no transparency on revenues. The second issue is the actual revenue use and how you use it to basically build investment in low carbon and in green transition, but also fund safety nets. Because again, we're living in an increasingly unequal world, and people tend to, some people have difficulties to make ends meet. And if you actually increase the price of gas, this is super detrimental to them. So how do you actually build safety nets for these people that are the hardest hit by the increasing carbon tax? And the third part is exemption. And this is actually perhaps the most important part. If I, as a citizen, pay this much tax and this much carbon prices, but I see that the big multinational is relying on carbon market prices that are half the price that I pay, the sense of fairness is completely undermined. And this is something that needs to be addressed. Just to come back quickly on wealth tax, I read a very interesting paper very recently on the issue, because wealth derives a lot from also the equity you have in a number of, let's say, companies. You could introduce a carbon aspect in the wealth tax, so as to say, this is your wealth, and your wealth covers this much, it translates to this much carbon prices. So you could definitely increase the wealth tax based on the carbon impact of your wealth. This is something that is being discussed at the Paris School of Economics and by a number of economics. You mentioned Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty. They're working on it. Perhaps we'll have some news in the coming weeks. But this is the fairness and the progressivity of how we answer this is key. Just to end up with one quick fact that Oxfam released very, very recently. Over the past 25 years, more than 40% of the increase in CO2 emission was because of the richest 5% of the population. So if we don't address the equity issue, we will never address the climate change issue altogether. Thank you.
Would somebody like to bounce off this comment? Go, Yvette. Actually, Antoine was giving you his spot for the question, so go ahead.
Okay. I was just wanting to add something for your discussion point on inequality and environmental taxes. And I think very often a lot of countries try to enforce tax policies through tax incentives when it comes to environmental aspects, because we know by experience that's the easiest way to change consumer behavior. But also, while doing that, you kind of have to start thinking more, what kind of groups within society are we benefiting with these tax incentives? So when we subsidize or give tax incentives for buying electricity cars, who still are very expensive, and we know that the cars that actually make the most damage are older fossil fuel driven cars, and they are only afforded by low income earners. So I think it's the same with lowered costs for solar panels, etc., we know it's wealthy people, homeowners who can afford this and can use those tax incentives. So a majority of these tax incentives that are actually aimed at, improving the environment are also at the same time just adding to this inequality in society. And in order for us to have some real environmental change, we kind of have to include everyone as well. So I think I rarely see that aspect discussed, and I would love to see more discussions on that, to be honest. That was just my point.
I see Elena and Himanshu and Quentin.
Yes, it's just a very, very brief comment. Yvette, thank you for raising the point of regressivity of environmental taxes. Just a small clarification or addition to that is that what you highlighted often happens in developed countries, but in developing countries, taxes such as environmental taxes or carbon taxes are often not regressive simply because the people who are really poor cannot afford even polluting cars. So for them, really the trade-off is between other aspects. So for example, a really poor person in a developing country would only have a trade-off between walking and taking the bus. And that's, I think, where the second part of your intervention, which is, we really need to make sure that everybody is included. That is really important. And it's really an important aspect of how we use revenues to make sure that we support broader systems and that we think a little bit outside of the box as well. That's all.
I would disagree just a little bit with what Elena said, because, for example, in a country like India or a poor country, if you do fossil fuel subsidy reform or raise the excise rate on fossil fuels, you do see a disproportionate impact on more poorer households. Because, they spend a higher share of the disposable income on, for example, going to work, etc. So it does impact, even in lower income countries. The environmental tax can affect the progressivity and be regressive. And I think it's an excellent point that we really need to think about policy design, sequencing, and communication when it comes to environmental taxation. Of course, revenue use and everything else is very important, but how it's perceived by the public is of utmost importance, and how it's sequenced. If we're complementing it with offsetting policy measures that kind of make sure that this short-term harm, which does happen to vulnerable and poor households, is taken care of. If we don't consider those things, then I think while we might have a very good objective, it's just not going to be sustainable. And we've seen that in Ecuador and in France, most famously recently.
Quentin?
Yes, just to agree with what Yvette just said, and on policy design, this is key. Just to give you one example, France very recently released a report with the breakdown of who benefits from which tax incentives by the size. And this is super helpful to see that some incentives that were actually designed to help people get better housing, better transportation units, and so on, were actually captured by by the richest deciles in the population that were actually not meant to benefit from it. So policy design and transparency is key to improve our public policies in terms of tax incentives, and especially green tax incentives.
Marta, Jacqueline?
May I add only, I am fully agree with all your arguments. I think transparency is a key issue. It's so important. Yvette told us, and Elena told the same. And also the point that progressivity should be a principle, not only for income, but also for tax expenditures. We need to have acceptance for the two parts of the public building.
And I would just add very quickly, I think when we're talking about the progressivity or regressivity of environmental taxes, country context is everything. You need to look at exactly what will happen in that specific country when you implement the tax, and then design, as Himanshu was saying, the compensation that will cover the problems that those income groups might then face. So we can see that the differences in Denmark are very different and to the challenges in India or Indonesia or wherever it is. It's always really just about, we can try and generalize, but in the end, if you're implementing a green fiscal policy, you need to understand that country really well.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing on the topic of regressivity or progressivity, we should also take into account the impact in terms of building a regressive tax system in a way that we distribute resources among countries also. So it's not just how the tax impact people within one specific jurisdiction, but the way that we design international tax rules and in the international tax system itself, and how that allocates resources among countries. So that's why I think we should start talking about the idea of the impact, the environmental impact of production and of distribution, and try to incorporate that into the rules that we have in order to allocate more resources to where the impact is happening. Because otherwise, if we just adopt, if we start adopting measures that don't take that into account, we might be creating more revenues for countries that already have revenues. So we do have to consider where the revenues are going as well. Thank you.
I think Antoine wanted to bounce off that.
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to come back to my original idea about political dynamics, and then you've given me plenty more to add to that. But I think my original point was that the link between environmental reform and COVID is political. There's no direct link. COVID is not an environmental crisis. It's probably the kind of stuff that happens more often because we're encroaching on natural environments, but it's not specifically an environmental crisis. And it probably doesn't change anything about the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. What it does change is that it's completely changing the political narrative in many countries. We're seeing it with governments getting reelected with extremely large margin of support that they couldn't have hoped for just a year ago. We've seen governments embark on very, very large program expansions that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. So that's really, I think, what's the main point about COVID for the question of the environment is that it opens up a window of opportunity. People are seeing states intervene much more than they usually do, and that is perhaps changing the views of people about state intervention in general. So there's a window for that, and you can perhaps transfer some of that new support for political intervention into the environment. That's the first question. The second point I wanted to make, and it's in relation to what Himanshu mentioned about creating selling the double dividend. That's actually what Canada has tried. Canada has the textbook double dividend. So we have a carbon tax, we have an output-based subsidies for large emitters. Essentially, we're taxing carbon and then rebating almost all of the funds to essentially get the substitution effect and get rid of the income effects. People don't understand the difference between substitution and income effects. The idea, as Irish data show, that people just think it's just shuffling the money around. We see that in Canada. It might turn out okay, but up until now, it's not clear that that design of carbon tax and rebate, that it's a political win. It's really not obvious. So perhaps we must consider the possibility of using the revenue for stuff that's more politically palatable. And one example, and I think it's been mentioned earlier, is renewables and green jobs. That's extremely popular, even amongst conservatives, amongst people who are staunchly opposed to taxation in general or carbon taxes. But when you're talking about industrial jobs, that's something that you can get a lot of people lined up behind. So there's something to think about that. And to come back on the point of using textbook instruments versus the reality, if Germany had not enacted a very aggressive policy of buying renewable energy at high rates, which is totally not textbook economics, then we would have never seen the drastic reduction in the cost of solar panels, which is probably the biggest story in the fight against climate change in the last 20 years, something that no one saw coming and that we probably would have never seen if we only had created large carbon taxes as the textbook recommendations go. So not only do you have to consider the political opportunity, you have to implement measures that are going to be self-sustaining, and that includes being much more fine-grained, being much more targeted, choosing industries that you want to support, even though that's not, that's not tax neutrality, but that's probably what you have to go through if we're serious about going carbon neutral.
As I welcome anyone to comment, this is in line with the one question I had in mind preparing for this session. I work in politics, and not for a long time, but still I've seen, I think, what they call the Overton window, like window of possibility, like massively shift, at least in Canada. And so I was, and to an extent, when I think about my environmental colleagues that are, I feel sometimes a bit sad that we see this opportunity only to try to maybe push forward the ideas that we've been pushing for decades without success. And so I was wondering, you all seem like extremely smart and creative people. So I was wondering, do people feel like opening up on, are there like Apollo program types ideas out there in the taxation world? Like what seemed totally crazy 6 months ago may actually be politically achievable now. So just wanted to encourage you all to share those crazy ideas. That's the only way that they actually become reality. And I think Jacqueline had raised their hand. I'm not sure if I
had, but not actually. Give me a minute to think about the revolution. I wanted to comment very quickly on what Antoine said, because I think it's a good point. There is no obvious link necessarily between this crisis and the window of opportunity that we're talking about now to drive a really big shift in environmental fiscal policy. But if we don't do it now, and if we don't recover in a green way, then we won't meet the Paris targets. That's absolutely clear. We won't achieve the SDGs. So even though there's not that direct link, it is kind of this last chance saloon feeling, I think. We need next year in Glasgow for the COP26, assuming it takes place actually live, we need that to be a decisive moment when there's an agreement, I believe, on an international carbon market that actually has quite high price. And we need to think there really hard about which innovative instruments we can have to redistribute the money raised through that tax to the countries that need it most to protect their vulnerable populations, and to really fund adaptation as well as mitigation measures. So I kind of slid towards a bit of it. I think we need a really big carbon market by next year. We need agreement on it. That would make a big difference to this discussion.
Elena?
I just wanted to pick up on something as well that Antoine said regarding political acceptability. So I work with the United Nations Subcommittee on Environmental Taxation, which is currently doing work on not only the design of carbon taxes, but taking into account the political acceptability aspect, which really can make or break carbon taxes and environmental policy more in general. And I think that, the aspect you mentioned about the really needing to be granular and detail-oriented when thinking about political acceptability is extremely important. Because, there are many examples where just the name you give to a carbon tax can really determine whether the public will accept it or not, or the way that it is introduced, or some very some aspects that might be considered really marginal and are actually not infringing on any of the basics and the principles, but they really make a big difference in the end. And this is not even, we don't even need to start talking about revenue use. This is really much sooner in the process. And I think that is an important aspect, and it highlights again a point that Jacqueline was mentioning earlier, I think, which is that, we can talk about best practices and textbook examples, but in the end, it's really every country that needs to draw on on intergovernmental guidance or whatever is available. But in the end, each country will need to think about how to shape their own design in their own domestic situation. And another aspect, maybe building on, some of the discussion that was going on earlier, is that I think in this world, there is no point really of talking about multilateral versus unilateral approaches as to juxtaposed approaches. There needs to be, going forward, a multi-layered approach where a strong basis, a strong framework is created in domestic taxation, but drawing on from international cooperation and broader principles which are established at the international level.
We have about, I think, 5 minutes left. Just piggyback of reaching an international agreement. Couldn't going through the OECD in order to introduce minimally sort of these taxes, could that help? And I also want to be mindful that Yvette had signaled she wanted to address EU dimensions. So just wanted to make sure you have...
No. I don't want to take up the precious time if someone actually has something really additive, value to add. So feel free to take that time from me.
Lots of pressure. Quentin?
Yes, just very quickly on the OECD. We've had a session on BEPS already. We've seen the difficulty to reach a consensus on BEPS on taxes already. If we add the green layer to the tax issue at the OECD level, we're still going to come back with the same political issues. With also the governance issue of who actually decides for green fiscal rules. Is it a set of developed countries or is it a larger governance body? So OECD is not the magic solution to that. I'm afraid it's much more complex than this.
I really hope someone's going to cut me off with their revolutionary idea to save everything. In the meantime, another question from the public, if somebody wants to jump on that one for the last few minutes. Shouldn't we also take into account the use of free resources, such as data provided by users when setting a tax rate? And big data is actually very energy consuming. I've just opened Pandora's box there.
I mean, I just find it interesting, for instance, in Sweden, we have lower electricity taxation in the north because, to benefit the people of the north because it's colder and, darker than the rest of Sweden. But we now see that a lot of these big IT multinationals, Facebook, Google, etc., they are actually, establishing big data server halls. They're utilizing extreme amounts of electricity, saving a lot of money because of this tax, once again, tax incentive. And once again, as you say, it stresses the environment enormously, but it also stresses the Swedish electricity system. So Sweden, who normally can run on renewable electricity, actually had to start using fossil fuels again this summer. So I think it's kind of like a very negative spiral once again. And I love how it's so closely linked to just the international tax problems we're having in general with tax planning and etc. multinationals. So this kind of just shows how everything links into each other, and we kind of need to start thinking of this much more seriously.
I think Himanshu and Tarcisio want to respond.
Yeah, I mean, just wanted to add one little point on the data center question. I mean, we also need to maybe look broader than just the data center issue, because if we just look at the data center, yes, it's increasing the carbon footprint, but if we look at the firm-wide carbon intensity and carbon footprint, maybe it's reducing it. These are the questions that we need to balance when thinking about environmental taxation, that we don't just think about, okay, this is a data center, so we tax it, but at a firm level, if it's reducing the overall carbon intensity in the longer term, then is it something that we want to disincentivize? Just a comment, nothing more.
I just wanted to add that the discussion on data at the level of the OECD is complicated because it is a question of distributing resources among countries. So that's what's creating obstacles for the OECD to move forward with the project there. But one way, going back again to adjusting prices for corporate tax purposes, so beyond imposing a carbon tax or imposing environmental taxes, one thing that we can think about is that environmental impacts reflect a cost savings for companies that in turn result in higher profits. So if we start, and this is something that we do, we already adjust prices for transfer pricing purposes, considering cost saved. So we start considering the environmental impacts are also a form of savings for companies that create higher profits. We can adjust their prices for corporate tax purposes. So, so this would be something different than imposing an environmental tax, but it's also something that can be done at the moment with the rules that we have.
I think that gets pretty close to an Apollo project within the existing rules. I think that brings this session to a close. I think I understand we keep going in about 3 minutes with Himanshu and Monsieur Lanois. So I guess this is a short break. Thank you very much for all participating. I hope somebody was taking notes because I feel like you may have solved some big issues here, or at least unpacked them.